This is a story about two twin sisters named Damiana and Julia. They just turned 17 and are ready to kick ass because they think they are so cool. The twist of this story is, the two sisters hate each other and were always trying to make the other look bad. This, overall, made them very not cool. One day, after a long day of shopping, the girls got back home to their huge house. There was always a bunch of people coming and going through their large front door. The girls went right to the guest room where one could get any help or supplies needed. They quickly opened the door and saw that there were two older women waiting for them. One with black hair and the other with silver hair. Both looked at them sternly. At the mention of their names, the girls knew who they must be. Their mom's maids. "Good evening," said the older woman. "How do you fare today?" "Pretty good," replied Damiana. "We just went to the mall." "I bet you did," laughed her sister. "What did you buy?" Julia just shook her head and ignored her sister. "Well, what can we help you with?" asked Julia. The maids looked at each other. "I'm afraid that it may be better if you girls took care of this yourselves," they said together. Julia started to object and then looked down. She had no choice but to agree. Damiana went into the kitchen and brought out a large box. The two maids followed her as she set it on the floor. Inside was a bunch of clothing, shoes, and other accessories. "Here's your new stuff," said Damiana. "It's all yours now." Julia gasped. "But we already have a whole closet full of clothes and stuff," she said. "This is too much." "Yeah, I know," answered her sister. "That's why we should just give it away." "Give it away," shouted Julia. "You don't even like it. You never wear it." "Why would we give it away?" "Because it belongs in the closet of someone who will wear it," said Damiana. "Why don't you go upstairs, put something on, and come down and try it on for us? We want you to look nice when we take you to the party." Said Julia, rolling her eyes. "Whatever." She went up the stairs to her room. In the meantime, their mom entered the living room and saw her husband sitting at the table playing chess with a very attractive young woman. He was wearing only his jeans and an open white shirt that displayed his toned chest muscles. It was obvious that he and this young woman were very into each other. Their mom was shocked. "Hello," she said. "Is that Julia? How did you get here?" The guy laughed. "Oh, I invited her." "Well then," said their mom. "Would you please ask your friend to leave? I want to speak to my daughter alone." "Sure thing," said the guy. "I'll see you both later." The two of them quickly got up and left the room. "Well," said Damiana's dad. "Looks like I need to go and get a drink." He stood up and went towards the bar. His wife followed him and stood right behind him as they talked about something. After a few seconds, Damiana's dad kissed the woman on the cheek and then left the room. "Hi Dad," she said. "What are you doing here?" He came up to her and put his hands around her waist. "I came for the same reason as you," he said. "I wanted to see you dance at the party tomorrow night." Damiana smiled at him and then said, "I've been practicing." His eyes lit up at that statement. "Really?" he said excitedly. "I didn't know you liked to dance." "Yeah," said Damiana. "It's fun." "Well, you're not doing too bad yourself," said his wife. She gave her husband another kiss on the cheek and left them alone. Damiana smiled at her father. They walked together towards the back of the room where the balcony was located. Damiana's dad sat down on the couch and motioned for his daughter to sit next to him. "So, what did you and your mom talk about?" he asked. "Just normal things," she replied. "But she really likes that guy." Her dad laughed. "I know. I think he's sweet." "I think so, too," said Damiana. "But I don't think he's that sweet." She thought for a second and then asked, "Do you think Mom knows what happened last night?" "I don't think she has any idea," answered her father. "If she had known, she would have told me." "Well, anyway," said Damiana, "I'm glad she doesn't know about that." Damiana's father smiled at her and then said, "Why don't you go practice some more?" "Okay," she said. "I will. I'll see you later." Damiana went upstairs and changed into one of her old outfits. She put on a pair of jeans and an old white t-shirt. She looked in the mirror and saw that she still didn't look too great. She left her room and went downstairs. She looked out the window to make sure that no one was there before she opened the door. She stepped outside onto the front porch. Her dad was standing near his car. He waved at her. "Hi, sweetie," he shouted. She came down to where he was standing. "Hi, Dad," she said. "How are you?" "I'm good," answered her dad. "I can't wait to see you dance." "Me neither," she said. "But I don't think I look all that great." "Oh honey," he said, putting his arm around her and pulling her close to him. "You look awesome." She hugged him back. "Thanks," she said. "I better get going," said her father. "Your mom is waiting for me in the living room." Damiana smiled at him. "Thanks, Dad." She then kissed his cheek. "Goodbye, Daddy." He kissed her back and said, "Bye." He turned around and walked away. Damiana went over to her car. She put her hands on the wheel and tried to smile. She knew that she still didn't look like a real dancer, but she thought she'd give it her best shot. She started the car and pulled out of the driveway. As she drove off, Damiana realized that she wasn't quite sure where she was supposed to go. She didn't know what she should do or where she would be when the party was over. She went up to the next street and turned onto it. As she did so, she saw a police car sitting at the end of the street. She thought that she recognized one of the officers inside, but couldn't for the life of her remember who it was. As she passed the police officer's car, she noticed that he turned around and looked at her. He watched as she drove by. Then he got out of his car and went towards the house. Damiana sat in her car and wondered what she should do. Should she stop at her own home and tell her parents where she was going? Or should she just drive straight on to the party and hope that nothing bad would happen to her there? She was still sitting there for a long time, trying to decide what to do, when a voice called out from behind her, "Hey! Hey you! What are you doing?" Damiana turned around and saw a black man standing on the front porch of his house. He had a large wooden stick in one hand. He looked mean. Damiana looked around and saw that several other people were walking towards him. All of them had sticks in their hands, too. One of them, a tall, muscular guy, came up to Damiana and pulled something out of his pocket. It was a shiny silver gun. He pointed it right at her head. "Hands on your head," he shouted. Damiana swallowed hard and did as he said. She reached up and placed her hands against her head, covering her face with her arms. "Are you all alone?" asked one of the other guys, a short, skinny black man. Damiana shook her head. "No," she whispered. The first guy laughed. "Good. Come on. You're coming with us." Damiana looked at him and shook her head. "I don't know you," she told him. "Why should I come with you?" He took the gun out of his pocket. "Because if you don't," he said, pointing it right at her again, "you won't live long enough to tell anyone about this." Damiana looked at the man in shock. "What?" she asked. "What are you talking about?" The man pointed the gun right at her once more. "You heard me," he said. "Come with us or you won't live to tell anyone." Damiana looked back at the house where her dad had been standing only seconds ago. Now there were no people on the front porch. Damiana shook her head. "No," she said softly. The black man took out another gun. This one was made of metal, and it looked like a pistol. He pointed it right at her chest. "Don't make me shoot you," he said. "Come with us and we'll give you some food to eat." Damiana looked up at him in horror. She took one look at his cold eyes and knew that she had nowhere to go. If these guys wanted her dead, there was nothing she could do to stop them from taking her away. She nodded. "Okay," she said. "Great," he said, grinning. "I'm Eddie. These guys over here are my friends. You can call us the Black Panthers." "What's this for?" asked one of the other men. He held a long wooden pole in his hand. "Why should we trust him? He looks like he might be part of the enemy." "Yeah," said the man next to him. "He does kinda look like a white guy." Eddie looked at Damiana. "How would you feel if I shot you?" he asked. "Would you think that you'd been tricked or would you trust me then?" "If you're going to shoot me," said Damiana, "you're going to have to shoot me now. There's no way out for me." "No, not that fast," said Eddie. He looked at her and smiled. "We've been waiting for you, all day. We thought we were going to get to kill you today, but you've turned up instead. That's good, though, because it means we'll be able to save you for later." He winked at her. Then he held his pistol up so everyone could see. "You know what this is?" he asked. "This is a gun. It shoots bullets. Bullets that will pierce your body and make it very uncomfortable for you to live. They can also hurt you badly. Now," continued Eddie, "let me ask you something else. Do you think that these bullets will do you any harm if they come from a gun like this one? Will they hurt you or even kill you?" He smiled again and nodded his head. "I didn't think so. But if you shot that girl with this gun, she'd be dead, wouldn't she?" Eddie had been talking for several minutes. By now, Damiana thought, surely someone had noticed she was being kidnapped. Maybe her father was coming to look for her. She looked back at the house and saw that he hadn't come out yet. "You still there?" asked Eddie, waving his pistol in front of her face. "Or are you going to try to run away before I'm ready?" Damiana swallowed hard. "I can't help it," she whispered. "I don't understand what's going on here." Eddie shook his head. "Don't worry," he said. "You will. Just relax and let me take care of everything." "Why did you kidnap me?" asked Damiana. "Where are you taking me?" The man with the pole spoke up. "You were just a little too slow, Damiana," he told her. "You had the chance to escape and you didn't take it. We're going to have a talk with your dad." Eddie grinned again. If we kill him, he said, you'll never see your mom or brother or sister again. Damiana shook her head. No, she said. I won't do it. If I kill my father, no one else will ever find me. Eddie nodded. That's true, he agreed. It's too bad for you. It really is. But we have to go through with this because it's part of our plan. Our plan? She asked. What does that mean? Eddie looked at her and grinned. Your daddy owes us money, bitch. 35 GS. We're not waiting any longer. Your money? She asked. The man with the metal gun shook his head. Don't worry, bitch, he said. We're not going to hurt you. We're just going to get all the cash that you have and leave you here. Wait a minute, said Damiana. How can I help you? Why should I give you my money? My family needs it. There are things I need to buy. I can't just leave them without anything to eat. The man who'd been talking to her waved his arm and pointed at the house. He spoke a few words in Spanish, but Damiana couldn't understand what he said. Then he turned back to her. This is what we want, he told her. We want everything you own. Your food, your furniture, your clothes, and most of all, your money. The man put the tip of his pole into the ground and knelt down on it. He took the money clip from his pocket and opened it up. Then he smiled and shook it, making sure that Damiana could see how much money there was in it. What about my jewelry? She asked. No problem, answered the man. We'll take the jewels too, if you have any. Or we might even sell them for you. He held out his hand again, and this time Damiana gave him the money. She also handed him her ring and necklace. Now what? She asked. Eddie nodded toward the man with the gun. The two of them carried the money across the field to the house. Eddie walked behind them, holding the pistol close to Damiana's body. He could feel her warmth through his shirt, and his cock started to get hard as soon as they entered the house. They went into the living room. Damiana felt her legs go weak as she looked around at all the furniture and possessions. Her father had done a lot of work to furnish their home over the last couple of years. She'd never realized just how rich he was. She was so focused on the new things in her home that she didn't notice the man coming up behind her. Before she knew it, he had grabbed her arms and was pulling her away from her dad. Damiana tried to resist him, but he just laughed. He pushed her against a sofa and sat down. Then he pulled her onto his lap and pinned her arms against her side. Then Julia came into the room, and saw her sister and the two men. Eddie pointed his gun at the girl's face, and Julia cried out. Damiana recognized the fear in her voice, and she let her head fall back against Eddie's chest. Don't worry, he told her, she won't be hurt. But she has to tell us everything she knows about our target. Julia's eyes widened and she shook her head. She started to say something, but Damiana stopped her. She turned her head and whispered to Julia, and then Julia fell silent. Now what? Asked Eddie. Damiana took a deep breath. I don't know where he is, she said. He always tells me not to tell anyone where he goes. I really can't help you. The man with the pole spoke up. We'll decide what you can do for us, he said. And we're going to do it right now. You're not going anywhere until we get all the money from your father, bitch. But. She started to protest. Then she saw her dad's wallet sitting on a small table near the sofa. She pointed at it and tried to pull away from Eddie. "Don't move," he warned her. Then he put the gun back to her head. "Keep your mouth shut or you'll regret it." She looked at him, then slowly nodded. Eddie took the wallet. It was empty, except for a couple of coins and some bills. The man with the pole took the money clip and counted the cash. When he was done, he tossed it over to Eddie. He opened the wallet and took out one of the cards. "This is his driver's license," he explained. "I want you to take care of this first, while Julia takes off your jewelry." Julia took the necklace and ring from Damiana's hands, then held them in her own. Her eyes were wide, but she didn't say a word. She just waited until Eddie pushed her down beside the sofa. Then he forced Julia to hand over the ring and necklace. He sat down next to her on the sofa and took the jewels into his hands. Then he leaned forward and began to examine them. "You have some good stuff here," he told the girl. "This is worth quite a lot of money, but there's not enough to pay for what we want." Damiana couldn't believe how much Eddie was laughing at her. His words were cruel, but his tone was even worse. He didn't care that she was crying. In fact, he was making her cry more by humiliating her with his laughter. "The police won't be able to find him either," he went on. "So you don't have to worry about anything." He handed back the necklace, and she took it gingerly. He let go of her arms, but kept the gun pointed at her. Then he stood up and walked across the room toward the hallway. "Give me your phone." Eddie took the cell phone from the girl's hand. He started typing in a number. "I want to hear his voice." He listened to the ringtone play once, then turned the phone around for Julia to see. It was a song that she loved. As soon as she heard it, her eyes filled with tears again. Then she looked away, and held her head low. "We'll keep this number on file for now," explained Eddie. "If we need it again, we'll give it back to you." He listened to the phone ring twice, and then hung up. When he put the phone in Damiana's hand, it rang again. Eddie turned to the man with the pole and said, "What's the plan, Jack?" Jack smiled at him, and then looked back at Julia. "She's done for the night. We can take care of her in the morning." The man with the pole nodded and started toward the hallway. Then he stopped and turned back to Eddie. He started laughing again. "How about that?" he said. "I'd always wondered what it would sound like to hear you say 'shut up, bitch.'" Eddie didn't even smile when he answered him. He just turned and headed into the hallway with the phone. Damiana stood there by the sofa, and tried to keep her tears from falling. The men left. Damiana was finally free. She took a deep breath and looked over at Julia, who was sobbing quietly on the couch. Damiana went to her sister and held her in her arms. "I'm so sorry," she told her. "I'm so sorry." It wasn't until after midnight that Julia managed to pull herself together. She got up off the couch, and made sure that Damiana was okay. Then she ran into the hall and closed the front door behind her. She opened the curtains to the big window on the south side of the house, and looked out. There was no sign of either of the men. Julia started to relax, and then she heard someone calling her name. It was Damiana, standing in the doorway. She had a worried look on her face, but also a small smile. She was holding something in her hand. "They gave me this for you," said Damiana. "I don't know what it is, but they didn't seem to think I should have it." Julia took the object out of Damiana's hand. It was a necklace made of yellowish gold with tiny pearls. She turned it around in her hands, and saw that there were 2 small charms dangling from it. One was a red stone with 3 holes, and the other was a shiny black stone with a large hole in the center. Both stones were carved with strange characters in an ancient language. She looked at Damiana, then shook her head. She couldn't tell what the necklace was for, or if she needed it. She put it on anyway, and went back to the sofa. "What are these?" she asked Damiana. "Why did they give them to you? Is there something else I should have?" Damiana smiled at her. "I don't know. Maybe." She picked up one of the charms and held it up between her fingers. Then she put it back down on the table, and lifted the other charm onto her middle finger. Julia watched as Damiana touched each end of the chain to the top of her little finger and ring finger. Her eyes closed, and a moment later, she was asleep. Julia sat next to her for a long time. After a while, she fell asleep too. They slept through the night without waking up once. When Julia woke up in the morning, Damiana was already up and dressed. She was sitting by the kitchen table eating breakfast. She looked so happy that Julia could hardly understand why she had been sad last night. "Good morning," said Julia. "You look happy today." Damiana smiled at her. "I am. Thank you for helping me last night." Julia shook her head. "It's nothing, really. I'm glad that you're safe now." Damiana leaned forward and kissed her gently on the cheek. "Thank you." Their father still wasn't home. Julia ran a comb through her hair, and then went out to the car. Her father owed those thugs money. Damiana was waiting for her in the driveway. She jumped into the passenger seat, and started talking before Julia could even get the key in the ignition. "You don't know how grateful I am to you, Julia. You saved my life. If it weren't for you..." Julia cut her off. "Don't worry about it, Damiana. I don't want you to feel obligated. Besides, I wasn't the one who saved your life." Damiana looked at her, confused. "Then who?" "My friend Jack over there. He was the one who kept things under control." "That's what friends are for." Damiana frowned. "Your friend?" She stared at the man. "The man with the pole?" "Yes, we're friends." "Why not?" The frown didn't leave Damiana's face. "You were going to kill me." "Julia. Did you know this was going to happen?" Julia shrugged. "No, of course not. But I could see where it was heading. And I knew I had to stop it somehow. Otherwise, it might have gone much worse than it did." Damiana looked at the man again. "He came here because of you?" "Because of me. Dad owes us," said Julia. "I was just getting what was mine." "And he paid you back in blood, I suppose." "I guess." Damiana's voice sounded like she was choking. Julia reached across the seat and gave her a hug. "It's okay, Damiana. I'm fine. We're both fine. Everything's going to be all right." "What the hell is wrong with you?" Damiana shouted. "What are you going to do? Kill our dad?" Julia laughed. "Of course not. This is family business. No one else needs to die." Damiana looked at her, confused. "But you killed him." "Not me. Him. He was trying to kill me." Damiana shook her head, and suddenly tears filled her eyes. How can you say that? Because it's true. Now come inside, and let's talk about this some more. Damiana nodded, and Julia drove toward the house. When they got there, Damiana went straight to her room. Julia heard her crying from behind the door. After a few minutes, Damiana came out. She was wearing a long-sleeved shirt and jeans instead of her usual short skirt. Julia wanted to ask her why, but she didn't say anything. Instead, she sat down on her bed, and waited. "I'm sorry I yelled at you," said Damiana after a while. Julia shook her head. "You don't need to apologize. You were in shock. And you were making fun of me. I never meant to make fun of you. I thought you were beautiful when I first saw you. I just wanted to tease you a little bit." Damiana looked at her. "Really?" Julia smiled. "Really? I liked you from the start. You're very pretty, and you have the most amazing smile. It makes people feel good." Damiana blushed. "You think so? I know so. And I still like you, you know." Damiana smiled. "Thank you. Everything will be okay. Trust me." "Trust you?" Damiana couldn't. "Yeah. You know I wouldn't lie to you." Damiana looked at her, puzzled. "Why?" "Because you're my friend. And if you trust me, I'll always tell the truth." Damiana nodded. "So what happened? What did Jack do?" Julia grinned. "Well, it turns out that he's a great shot. In fact, he's an expert marksman. Then, I called the police." Damiana looked at her. "And?" "The police arrested Jack, and they took him away. For assault, and attempted murder." Damiana looked at her. "Attempted? Dad isn't." "That's right. He's not. He's alive, and well, and he has no idea what happened last night." Damiana stood up. "Will you come with me?" "Where?" "To see him. To say goodbye." "I won't go without you." Julia nodded, and followed her to the front door. As they walked out, Julia wondered if everything would be all right. The next day, everyone gathered in the living room. There was a lot of crying, and hugging, and kissing. A few people were even dancing, and singing. Damiana hugged everyone she could find, and cried into their shoulders. The whole family was reunited, and now they could start working on rebuilding their lives. They'd been through a lot, they deserved some happiness. Damiana finally came over and sat down next to Julia. She sniffled, and wiped a tear from her eye. "I missed you so much," she whispered. Julia put her arm around her shoulder. "I missed you too. But now we're together again. I'm glad. I wish I could stay longer, but I need to get home. My mom is worried sick about me." Julia looked at her. "Your mother is here?" "Yes, of course. She flew back from Paris yesterday morning." "Then why haven't you gone to see her yet?" "Because she's sleeping. She has a lot on her mind, and it's making her tired." Julia shook her head. "She shouldn't push herself. She needs to rest." "Maybe. But I don't want to wait any longer. I need to go see her." "Okay. Let's go." They left the living room and walked down the hallway. Julia took a key from her pocket and unlocked the door. At the same time, Damiana placed her hand on the doorknob. She turned it, and the door swung open. Julia gasped as she stepped inside. Her eyes widened, and her mouth dropped open. Everything was covered with blood. There were blood stains on the floor, walls, ceiling, and furniture. Blood splatters stained the carpet and rugs. There were pools of red everywhere, and a trail of bloody footprints leading in and out of the room. At first, Julia thought it might have been caused by a murder scene. After all, the house had been invaded, someone had broken in. But then, as she approached, she noticed something strange. All the doors were closed and locked. Julia moved slowly through the room, staring at the blood. A terrible feeling gripped her stomach. Something wasn't right. She glanced around for a weapon, or a knife, or anything that could help her figure out what happened. Then she felt the small object in her pocket. She pulled it out and examined it. It was a small black box, shaped like a tombstone. The words, "Beware of the dark side," were engraved on its surface. It was the Death Star. Julia held the device tightly in her hands, and trembled. She knew the Death Star was dangerous. It was a powerful tool, and it could destroy entire planets. But this one, she realized, was different. She didn't know how, or why. But something about it made her feel uneasy. As she looked around the room, she spotted a body lying on the floor. She went over to it, and saw that it was Jack. He was dead. His throat had been slit, and his eyes were wide open. A pool of dark liquid was seeping out of his mouth. Julia knelt down beside him, and touched his cheek. He was cold, and stiff. She gently closed his eyes, and wiped the tears from her face. "Jack," she whispered. "What happened?" Suddenly, there was a loud bang. Julia jumped, and looked up. A bright light appeared in the corner of the room, and began to grow larger. It grew so large, that it filled the entire room. The light focused on Julia, and she felt her skin begin to burn. She screamed, and tried to run away, but the light followed her. She fell to the ground, and rolled around. When she stopped moving, the light was gone. She lay on her side, gasping for breath. Julia reached out, and touched Jack's chest. She felt a sharp pain, and her fingers began to bleed. "No," she screamed. Blood poured from her fingertips, and trickled down the carpet. Julia awoke with a start. She opened her eyes, and stared at the ceiling. "Oh God," she muttered. That was horrible. Her heart was beating rapidly, and she couldn't catch her breath. She felt dizzy, and her stomach roiled. She sat up quickly, and clutched her head in her hands. "I can't do this," she screamed. "I can't. I can't take it anymore." "Julia, are you okay?" asked Damiana. She was sitting up in bed, rubbing her eyes. I am fine," said Julia. "Just a bad dream." "Well, it's getting late. You should try to get some sleep." "Yeah. Maybe I will." Julia got out of bed, and started walking to the bathroom. As she entered, she paused. The door was open. She remembered locking it before going to bed. Why hadn't she? The door was open. She walked closer, and peeked inside. The mirror had been smashed. Damiana frowned. "What is it?" Julia sighed and shrugged her shoulders. Nothing important. Just a nightmare. You looked really scared when you woke up. Is there anything I can do to help? Julia shook her head. No. Just go back to sleep. Okay. Damiana smiled. Good night. Julia returned to her bedroom and climbed back into bed. She turned off the light and tried to fall asleep. It wasn't easy. But eventually, she managed. The next morning, Julia awoke early and got ready for school. She walked downstairs and saw Damiana standing by the counter. Her hair was still wet from the shower, and her face glistened with moisture. Damiana looked exhausted. She hadn't slept well. As Julia approached, Damiana placed 2 slices of toast on a plate. She handed it to Julia and smiled. Eat. Julia took the food and sat down at the table. She felt nauseous and her stomach growled. What happened last night? Asked Julia. Oh, said Damiana, hesitantly. It's nothing. Julia raised an eyebrow and gave her a suspicious look. Really? Yes. Really, said Damiana. Don't worry about it. Julia's expression remained unchanged. Damiana sighed. I'm sorry I've been so distant. I don't mean to be unfriendly. Oh. That's okay, said Julia. It doesn't bother me. I guess I just have a hard time getting used to people. Well, said Damiana. That's good to hear. You're welcome here, as long as you want to stay. Thanks. Hey, where were you last night? Asked Damiana. I went out, said Julia. With my friends. Damiana nodded. That's fine. Julia grabbed her coat from the hook in the hallway. See you later, she said, and left. When Julia got home, she ran upstairs. She sat down on her bed and took a deep breath. She was terrified. Terrified that what had happened last night would happen again. Terrified that she might end up dead. She couldn't help but think of Jack, lying cold and dead, and her heart began to beat faster. She buried her face in her hands and wept. After several minutes, she felt exhausted. She stood and walked back downstairs. She sat at the table and ate her breakfast. Then she went upstairs. Later that morning, Julia knocked on Damiana's door. When there was no answer, she opened the door and entered. The house looked very different than when Julia had first arrived. There were a number of bookshelves in the living room, filled with dozens of books. The kitchen was now well stocked with food, and the refrigerator was full of fresh vegetables. There were also new posters on the walls. Julia walked into the bedroom and saw that Damiana had unpacked her clothes and hung them in the closet. There were even 2 new beds in the room. One for Damiana and one for Julia. Julia smiled. I'm glad you're happy here, said Damiana. You can stay as long as you want. Julia nodded. Thanks. Damiana smiled. If you need anything, just ask. I'll be happy to help. Julia nodded. I'll get some more groceries today, said Damiana. So we don't run out. And I'll buy a few more books. Maybe you'd like to read some of them? Julia smiled. Sure. Thanks. Damiana smiled back. Okay. See you later. Julia walked downstairs and headed toward the front door. As she reached the door, she stopped. She turned around and stared at Damiana. "What?" asked Damiana. "Nothing," said Julia. Damiana shrugged. "Okay. Have fun." Julia nodded and left. That night, Julia lay in bed, staring at the ceiling. She thought about Damiana and what had happened last night. She had been so frightened. Terrified that she might have killed someone. Terrified that she might die herself. And then, after she had finally fallen asleep, she had had another nightmare. This time, it was worse than the previous ones. In the dream, she was walking down a dark hallway. Suddenly, a door appeared in the wall. It opened, and a man stepped out. He was wearing a black robe, and his face was covered by a white mask. He pointed a knife at Julia, and said, "Hello, Julia. You have come to see me." Julia screamed. The man laughed, and said, "Oh, you're scared, aren't you? Well, I am here to kill you. If you try to run away, I will chase you, and stab you to death. Do you understand?" Julia nodded. "Good," said the man. "Now, put your hands behind your back, and walk forward." Julia did as she was told. The man pulled her into the room, and closed the door. Then he took off his mask. His face was hideous. A rotting, decaying, decomposing thing. He grabbed Julia's wrists, and twisted them painfully. "I will kill you, Julia," said the man. "Do you understand?" Julia nodded. "Good," said the man. "Now, I must ask you one question. What is your name?" Julia stared at him. "My name is Julia." The man laughed. "Very good. Now, tell me something else. Do you love me?" Julia shook her head. "Good," said the man. "Then you can never escape from me. You will be trapped here forever. And you will die, and rot, and decay, and turn to dust." Julia gasped. The man laughed again. "You will never leave this room. You will never see the light of day. You will be forgotten, and your name will be lost to history. Do you understand?" Julia nodded. The man laughed. "Good. Now, I will kill you." He pulled out a knife, and stabbed Julia in the chest. Julia screamed. Then she woke up, and began to cry. Julia ran out of the house. She didn't know where she was going. All she knew was that she had to get away. She ran through the woods, and when she came to a clearing, she stopped. There, in the middle of the clearing, was a large stone statue. It was shaped like a human being, but it was very strange. The statue's head was covered by a hood, and its hands were bound together. There were chains around its feet, and a chain around its waist. Julia walked closer to the statue. It looked as if it was made of the same stone as the house. But it was much larger than the house. "What is this?" asked Julia. She sat down on the ground, and stared at the statue. A few moments later, someone appeared behind the statue. It was Damiana. Julia jumped up. "Damiana." "Julia," said Damiana. "Are you all right?" Julia nodded. "Why are you crying?" asked Damiana. "I had a bad dream," said Julia. Damiana nodded. "Let's go back inside, and talk about it." Julia nodded. They went back into the house. Julia sat down on the couch and tried to stop crying. "Can I read a book?" asked Julia. Damiana nodded. "Sure. What would you like to read?" Julia thought for a moment. "How about Alice in Wonderland? I haven't read that one yet." Damiana smiled. "Okay. Let me get it." She went to the bookcase and pulled out the book. Then she sat down next to Julia. "So," said Damiana, "what happened in your dream?" Julia took a deep breath. "It was horrible," she said. "I dreamed that there was a man with a knife, and he wanted to kill me. But instead of killing me, he cut my heart out of my chest, and then he ate it." Damiana gasped. "That's terrible. What did you do?" "I ran away," said Julia. "But he chased me, and he stabbed me, and then he cut my heart out of my chest, and he ate it." Damiana nodded. "Probably because you tried to have Dad killed." Julia nodded. Damiana frowned. "Did you do it?" Julia shook her head. "No, I didn't want him dead. I just wanted to be free. And I never wanted to see him again." Damiana sighed. "I'm sorry, Julia. I wish I could help you." Julia smiled. "Thanks. I'm okay now." Damiana nodded. "All right. Why don't you go back to bed?" Julia nodded. "Okay." Damiana got up and went to the door. She opened it and looked outside. There was no one there. Damiana closed the door and turned around. She was surprised to see that Julia was gone. She walked back into the living room. "Julia," she called. "Where are you?" But there was no answer. Damiana searched the house. She went upstairs and looked in the bedrooms. She looked downstairs and even checked the basement. But she couldn't find Julia anywhere. Damiana went to the front door and opened it. Then she looked outside. And there, on the porch, was a large stone statue. It was shaped like a human being, but it was very strange. The statue's head was covered by a hood, and its hands were bound together. There were chains around its feet, and a chain around its waist. Damiana gasped. She walked closer to the statue. It looked as if it was made of the same stone as the house. But it was much larger than the house. Damiana sat down on the ground and stared at the statue. A few moments later, someone appeared behind the statue. It was Julia. Damiana jumped up. "Julia." "Damiana," said Julia. "Are you all right?" Damiana nodded. "Why are you crying?" asked Julia. Damiana took a deep breath. "I had a bad dream," she said. Julia nodded. "Let's go back inside and talk about it." Damiana nodded. They went back into the house. Damiana sat down on the couch and tried to stop crying. "Can I read a book?" asked Damiana. Damiana nodded. "Sure. What would you like to read?" Damiana thought for a moment. "How about Alice in Wonderland? I haven't read that one yet." Damiana smiled. "Okay. Let me get it." She went to the bookcase and pulled out the book. Then she sat down next to Damiana. "So," said Damiana, "what happened in your dream?" Damiana took a deep breath. It was horrible, she said. I dreamed that there was a man with a knife, and he wanted to kill me. But instead of killing me, he cut my heart out of my chest, and then he ate it. Damiana paused. That's terrible, said Damiana. Julia nodded. I ran away, she said. But he chased me, and he stabbed me, and then he cut my heart out of my chest, and he ate it. Damiana nodded. Probably because you tried to have Dad killed. Julia nodded. Damiana sighed. I'm sorry, Julia. I wish I could help you. Julia smiled. Thanks. I'm okay now. Damiana nodded. All right. Why don't you go back to bed? Julia nodded. Okay. Damiana got up, and went to the door. She opened it, and looked outside. There was no one there. Damiana closed the door, and turned around. She was surprised to see that Julia was gone. She walked back into the living room. Julia, she called. Where are you? Julia came out from behind the statue. Damiana jumped up. Julia. Julia smiled. Hey, Damiana. Are you all right? Damiana nodded. Why did you disappear like that? Julia shrugged. I don't know. I just felt like it. Damiana frowned. Was it a bad dream? Julia nodded. Yes. It was horrible. Damiana nodded. It must have been awful. Let's talk about it. Julia nodded. Okay. Damiana sat down on the couch, and Julia sat next to her. So said Damiana. What happened in your dream? Julia took a deep breath. I was running away from him, she said. He had a knife, and he wanted to kill me. But instead of killing me, he cut my heart out of my chest, and he ate it. Julia paused. This seemed all too familiar. A sudden case of déjà vu? Did you try to have Dad killed? Asked Damiana. This had to be a bad dream. Was she being punished? Julia shook her head. No, I didn't try to have Dad killed. Damiana smiled. Why not? Julia shrugged. I don't know. It just didn't seem like a good idea. Damiana nodded. You're right. It doesn't sound like a good idea at all. Julia nodded. Anyway, I ran away, and then I heard him coming after me. He stabbed me, and then he cut my heart out of my chest, and he ate it. Damiana took a deep breath. I'm sorry. Julia nodded. I'm okay now. Damiana looked at the statue. Is there anything else you want to tell me? Julia thought for a moment. Anyway, I ran away, and then I heard him coming after me. He stabbed me, and then he cut my heart out of my chest, and he ate it. Julia paused. Damiana took a deep breath. I'm sorry. Julia nodded. I'm okay now. Damiana looked at the statue. Is there anything else you want to tell me? Julia thought for a moment. There was this old man with a cane, and he had a knife, and he wanted to kill me. But instead of killing me, he cut my heart out of my chest, and he ate it. Damiana nodded. Did you try to have Dad killed? Julia shook her head. No, I didn't try to have Dad killed. Damiana nodded. Why not? Julia shrugged. I don't know. It just didn't seem like a good idea. Damiana sighed. You're right. It doesn't sound like a good idea at all. Julia nodded. Anyway, I ran away, and then I heard him coming after me. He stabbed me, and then he cut my heart out of my chest, and he ate it. This couldn't be happening. 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 Damiana nodded. Did you try to have Dad killed? Julia shouted. No, I didn't try to have Dad killed. Leave me alone. Julia's eyes started to tear up. It was horrible, she said. I could feel my heart beating, and I could feel my blood spilling out, and it felt so real. It hurt so much. Damiana put her arm around Julia. It'll be okay. I'm here for you. Julia nodded. I'm okay now. Damiana smiled. Are you sure? Julia nodded. Yes. Damiana sat on the couch. Tell me about your dream again. Julia nodded. I was running away from him. He had a knife, and he wanted to kill me. But instead of killing me, he cut my heart out of my chest, and he ate it. Julia paused. There had to be a way out of this cycle. Damiana took a deep breath. I'm sorry. Julia nodded. I'm okay now. Damiana nodded. What do you think about this dream? Julia thought for a moment. Well, it sounds like something that happened in the past. Maybe it's not real. Damiana nodded. Did you try to have Dad killed? Julia couldn't take it anymore. Yes, she shouted. I wanted Dad dead. I wanted the money I deserved. We're fucking rich, but somehow he gets to control how much we get. It's not fair. Julia's head was spinning. She wanted to run away. Run away from her family. Run away from her life. I didn't want him dead, she said. I just wanted him to die. Damiana nodded. It will all be over soon, sister. Don't worry, it'll hurt for a moment. But only for a moment. And that was a story about two twin sisters named Damiana and Julia who were ready to kick ass.